of courtly breeding and discrimination, though they may have been born in Mahalahonda. I say of discrimination, because there are many who are not so, and discrimination is the grammar of good language, if it be accompanied by practice. I, sirs, for my sins have studied canon law at Salamanca, and I rather pick myself on expressing my mean in clear, plain, and intelligible language. If you did not pick yourself more on your dexterity with those foils you carry than on dexterity of tongue, said the other student, you would have been head of the degrees, where you are now tail. Look here, bachelor Corchuelo, returned the licentiate, you have the most mistaken idea in the world about skill with the sword, if you think it useless. It is no idea on my part, but an established truth, replied Corchuelo. And if you wish me to prove it to you by experiment, you have swords there, and it is a good opportunity. I have had a steady hand and a strong arm, and these joined with my resolution, which is not small, will make you confess that I am not mistaken. Dismount and put it in practice your positions and circles and angles in science, for I hope to make you see stars at noonday with my rude raw swordsmanship, in which, next to God, place my trust that the man is yet to be born who will make me turn my back, and that there is not one in the world I will not compel to give ground. As to whether you turn your back or not, I do not concern myself, replied the master of fence, though it might be that your grave would be dug on the spot where you placed your foot the first time. I mean that you would be stretched dead there for despising skill with the sword. We shall soon see, replied Corchuelo, and getting off his ass briskly, he drew out furiously one of the swords the licentiate carried on his beast. It must not be that way, said Don Quixote at this point. I will be the director of this fencing match, and judge of this often disputed question. And dismounting from Rocinante, and grabbing his lance, he planted himself in the middle of the road, just as the licentiate, with an easy, graceful bearing and step, advanced toward Corchuelo, who came on against him, darting fire from his eyes, as the saying is. The other two of the company, the peasants, without dismounting from their asses, served as spectators of the mortal tragedy. The cuts, thrusts, downstrokes, backstrokes, and doubles that Corchuelo delivered were past counting, and came thicker than hops or hail. He attacked like an angry lion, but he was met by a tap on the mouth from the button of the licentiate's sword that checked him in the midst of his furious onset, and made him kiss it as if it were a relic, though not as devoutly as relics are and ought to be kissed. The end of it was that the licentiate reckoned up for him the thrust every one of the buttons of the short cassock he wore, tore up the skirts into strips, like the tails of a cuttlefish, knocked off his hat twice, and so completely tired him out, that in vexation, anger, and rage, he took the sword by the hilt and flung it away with such force, that one of the peasants that were there, who was a notary, and who went for it, made an affidavit afterwards that he sent it nearly 3/4 of a league, which testimony will serve, and has served, to show and establish with all certainty that strength is overcome by skill. Corchuelo sat down wearied, and Sancho approached him and said, By my faith, señor bachelor, if your worship takes my advice, you will never challenge any one to fence again, only to wrestle and throw the bar, for you have the youth and strength for that. But as for these fencers, as they call them, I have heard say they can put the point of a sword through the eye of a needle. I am satisfied with having tumbled off my donkey, said Corchuelo, and with having had the truth I was so ignorant of proved to me by experience. And getting up he embraced the licentiate, and they were better friends than ever. And not caring to wait for the notary who had gone for the sword, as they say he would be a long time about it, they resolved to push on so as to reach the village of Quiteria, to which they all belonged, in good time. During the remainder of the journey the licentiate held forth to them on the excellences of the sword, with such conclusive arguments, and such figures and mathematical proofs, that all were convinced of the value of the science, and Corchuelo cured of his dogmatism. It grew dark, but before they reached the town it seemed to them all as if there was a heaven full of countless glittering stars in front of it. They heard, too, the pleasant mingled notes of a variety of instruments, flutes, drums, psalteries, pipes, tabors, timbrels, and as they drew near they perceived that the trees of a leafy arcade that had been made constructed at the entrances of the town were filled with lights unaffected by the wind, for the breeze at the time was so gentle that it had not power to stir the leaves on the trees. The musicians were the life of the wedding, wandering through the pleasant grounds in separate bands, some dancing, others singing, others playing the various instruments already mentioned. In short, it seemed as though mirth and gaiety were frisking and gambolling all over the meadow. Several other persons were engaged in erecting raised benches from which people might conveniently see the plays and dances that were to be performed the next day on the spot dedicated to the celebration of the marriage of Camacho the Rich and the obsequies of Basilio. Don Quixote would not enter the village, although the peasant as well as the bachelor pressed him. He excused himself, however, on the grounds, amply sufficient in his opinion, that it was the custom of knights errant to sleep in the fields and woods in preference to towns, even were it under gilded ceilings, and so turned aside a little out of the road, very much against Sancho's will, as to the good quarters he had enjoyed in the castle or house of Don Diego came back to his mind. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Wherein an account is given of the wedding of Camacho the Rich, together with the incident of Basilio the Poor. Scarce had the fair Aurora given bright Phoebus time to dry the liquid pearls upon her golden locks with the heat of his fervent rays, when Don Quixote, shaking off sloth from his limbs, sprang to his feet and called to his squire Sancho, who was still snoring. Seeing which Don Quixote ere he roused him and thus addressed him: Happy thou, above all dwellers on the face of the earth, that, without envying or being envied, sleepest with the tranquil mind, that neither enchanters persecute nor enchantments affright. Sleep, I say, and will say 100 times, without any jealous thoughts of thy mistress to make thee keep ceaseless vigils, or any cares as to how thou art to pay the debts thou owest, or find tomorrow's food for thyself and thy needy little family, to interfere with thy repose. Ambition breaks not thy rest, nor doth this world's empty pomp disturb thee, for the utmost reach of thy anxiety is to provide for thy ass, since upon my shoulders thou hast laid the support of thyself, the counterpoise and burden that nature and custom have imposed upon masters. The servant sleeps, and the master lies awake, thinking of how he is to feed him, advance him, and reward him. The distress of seeing the sky turn brazen, and withhold its needful moisture from the earth, is not felt by the servant but by the master, who in time of scarcity and famine must support him who has served him in times of plenty and abundance. To all this Sancho made no reply because he was asleep, nor would he have wakened up as soon as he did had not Don Quixote brought him to his senses with the butt of his lance. He awoke at last, drowsy and lazy, and casting his eyes about in every direction, observed, There comes, if I don't mistake, from the quarter of that arcade a steam and a swell of a great deal more like fried rashers than galingale or thyme. A wedding that begins with smells like that, by my faith, ought to be plentiful and unstinting. Have done, thou glutton, said Don Quixote. Come, let us go and witness this bridal, and see what the rejected Basilio does. Let him do what he likes, returned Sancho. Be he not poor, he would marry Quiteria, to make a grand match for himself, and he without a farthing. Is there nothing else? Faith, señor, it's my opinion the poor man should be content with what he can get, and not go looking for dainties on the bottom of the sea. I will bet my arm for that Camacho could bury Basilio in reals, and if that be so, as no doubt it is, what a fool Quiteria would be to refuse that fine dresses and jewels Camacho must have given her and will give her, and take Basilio's bar throwing and sword play. They won't give a pint of wine at the tavern for a good cast of the bar or a neat thrust of the sword. Talents and accomplishments that can't be turned into money, lest Count Dirlos have them. But when such gives fault to one that has hard cash, I wish my condition of life was as becoming as they are. On a good fountain you can raise a good building, and the best fountain in the world is money. For God's sake, Sancho, said Don Quixote here, stop that harangue. It is my belief, if thou wert allowed to continue all thou beginnest every instant, thou wouldst have no time left for eating or sleeping, for thou wouldst spend it all in talking. If your worship had a good memory, replied Sancho, you would remember the articles of our agreement before we started from home this last time. One of them was that I was to be let say all I liked, so long as